Boris Johnson has sought to provide answers to some of the many questions being asked about his plan to relax the lockdown in England. The Prime Minister has published a 50-page document, a roadmap, which he says will work on condition that people follow the rules. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have their own powers, and they say it's too soon to relax measures to the same extent, and they are still telling people to stay at home. But in England, from Wednesday, people can go outdoors as often as they want and can meet with one person from another household in a public space as long as social distancing is respected. The advice remains to work from home if possible, but if not, workers in manufacturing and construction can go back from Wednesday, though ideally not by public transport. And in a new development for England, people are advised to wear face coverings in enclosed spaces where the 2-metre rule can't be observed. From the 1st of June, there'll be a phased return for schools and nurseries in England with the goal of getting all primary school pupils back for a month before the summer. More shops will also be able to open, and some sporting events will be given the go-ahead, but without spectators in the grounds. From July, hairdressers, some bars and restaurants and leisure facilities could begin to reopen. All of this is conditional on a continued fall in the number of new coronavirus cases. Now, in the latest 24-hour period, 210 deaths linked to coronavirus were recorded in the UK, and that brings the total so far to 32,065. We start tonight with this report by our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
Was the day any different? On the wild Yorkshire coast? On the quiet Manchester commute? To a few more travellers on London's lines, all trying to work out what the slow train to a new normal really looks like, with many questions tonight, but direct to the Prime Minister.
Yesterday you left the nation with more questions than answers. Why have you been so vague with who can start back at work and which businesses can reopen this week?
It's when you come to take small steps back to normality, as we are now, that clearly the message becomes finer, more complicated.
Where schools have remained accessible to children of key workers, are they now expected to allow children to return where their parents are from industries that are being actively encouraged to return to work? If not, how do you propose these people return to work if there's no childcare available?
I think it's only fair to regard that as an obvious barrier to their ability to go back to work, and I'm sure that employers will agree with that.
How is it logical that I, as a primary school teacher, can mix with the many returning children, but seeing my relatives is still not allowed?
People can see somebody who isn't in their household, but you have to do it one-on-one, outdoors, and obeying social distancing.
Earlier, there were plenty of questions from MPs too. The Prime Minister made no bones about the complexity, but the opposition, like many of the public, wants crystal clear messages too.
What the country needs at this time is clarity and reassurance, and at the moment both are in pretty short supply. And at the heart of the problem, it seems, is that the Prime Minister made a statement last night before the plan was written or at least finalised, and that has caused considerable confusion.
And whether it's near empty parks in Cardiff or deserted beaches of Aberdeen, the administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are taking a different path, sticking to the stay-at-home message with sharp political disagreement.
It is obvious that the last 24 hours has spread confusion. What the public desperately needs today is to be given some clarity. Mr. Speaker, lives are at risk, so political judgments and verdicts on this weekend's chaos will have to wait for another day.
There is now a three-nations approach. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all agree on policy and message. And I mean this with no malice, but for the sake of clarity, can he confirm that in almost everything he has announced today, the Prime Minister is acting as the Prime Minister of England?
No, Mr. Speaker, I reject that completely. It is a very good advice for the entire population of the United Kingdom, though I perfectly respect the inflections and variations that may be necessary both locally, regionally and nationally to reflect differences in those areas.
In number 10, there's been worry for weeks, not just about the disease, of course, but about how to keep the public on side when a new phase begins with more complicated instructions. Those concerns were well placed.
There are, Prime Minister, different instructions for people in different parts of the UK. You can see your colleagues if you go to work, but grandparents can't look after their children. Many employers say they're just not ready to have people back to work yet. So what do you say to millions of people watching right now who may well be a bit perplexed by what you're actually trying to say and what they are meant to do?
Yes, of course. The message that we were giving out initially was incredibly clear and incredibly stark. And the UK population actually obeyed it more thoroughly, perhaps than many other populations around the world. We really did stay at home. We need to make progress, if we possibly can, in relaxing some of the measures very, very cautiously.
The elastic bonds between Westminster, Belfast, Edinburgh and Cardiff are certainly being stretched. And in private, frustration among Tory MPs is bubbling up too. One cabinet minister confided the situation is so complicated they feel like they almost can't win. But no question, unease about the government's handling of the crisis is certainly starting to spread.
This emergency is on such a scale, it's impossible for the course to be smooth. But when lives and livelihoods are both at stake, political anxiety is running high too.
Let's go live to Westminster, and Laura joins us now for the latest. And last night, Laura, we were talking about these repeated calls for clarity from the Prime Minister. In your view, did he deliver on those demands today?
Well, to an extent, Hugh, and you're right, when we talked last night, the Prime Minister had given his broad outline from the Grand State Dining Room in Downing Street. But by giving broad principles, he also raised lots of question marks. Now, today we did see from the government a forest of paper, pages and pages and pages of documents of all sorts of different guidelines that have gone a long way to answer some of those vital questions that many people were wondering about, giving clarification in particular that people who have been stuck within four walls just with their household only popping out occasionally will be able to see one other person as long as they're outdoors and as long as they are keeping their distance. And in terms of what it means for people going back to work, well, significant tonight, I think, that the TUC, the unions group, has said that the plans they have now seen are a step in the right direction. That said, I think the reality is we are into a more complicated phase. As the lockdown is gradually unrolled, that is going to mean it's harder for the government to give precision about every single tiny thing. And they do reckon that that will rely on more of us using our own personal judgments about how we live our lives based on broad principles and new rules and regulations that will evolve over time, rather than that one big blanket message of stay at home that people followed to such a great extent. And the other thing that I think is certainly true is that political consensus that had broadly held in the first couple of months of this crisis is certainly fractured now, particularly with sharp differences between the four governments of the UK. Tensions between Westminster and Edinburgh, Belfast and Cardiff have become quite acute. And it's hard to see, even though they are still sharing the same advice, they are still communicating, and many of the rules remain very much the same. Those political differences of tone and atmosphere are absolutely there now.
Laura, once again, many thanks. Laura Ginsberg there with the latest at Westminster.